It began on a night so quiet, you could hear the trees breathing, in the middle of a snow-laden forest in Maine, where the silence pressed in like a heavy blanket and the stars hung low enough to almost touch. Asher Hale stirred from sleep. A distant knock echoed through the thick wooden walls of his cabin, soft at first, then sharper, like desperation sharpening its edge. He sat up, heart stuttering. No one came out this far, not unless they were lost or running from something. The wind outside howled like an injured animal, but that knock came again, more urgent. Asher pulled on his coat and opened the heavy door. What he saw next would become the axis on which his world turned. There, shivering in the dim lantern light, stood a boy barely old enough to reach the doorknob. His arms wrapped tightly around a smaller bundle, a girl with frostbitten cheeks and blood drying on her knee. Their clothes were soaked. Their eyes told stories their mouths couldn't yet form. No words were spoken, only that look, that pleading, fragile look that said, "Please, just let us be safe for one night." Asher didn't ask questions. He stepped aside. The boy hesitated for a heartbeat, then carried his sister in. Behind them, the storm groaned louder, like it had found what it was chasing and lost. Years earlier, Asher had walked away from everything, or rather been pushed. His parents had called it a choice, but there was no real choice between lying and leaving. He had told them he was gay. They told him he was no longer welcome. The same people who taught him how to tie his shoes and say grace at dinner sent him out the door with nothing but a duffel bag and silence. He'd found this cabin by accident, deep in the woods where even the roads gave up. He never meant to stay, but days turned to seasons, and seasons turned to years. The isolation grew roots in his bones. He chopped wood, built shelves, fixed old tools, and convinced himself that solitude was peace, that needing no one was strength, but the silence only ever masked the hunger. He had never expected company, least of all two half-frozen children with no names, no explanations, and eyes that reminded him too much of his own in the mirror haunted and hoping at the same time. That night, he sat them near the stove, wrapped them in quilts, and stirred a pot of old rice and carrots into something warm. The girl slept through the night, curled like a kitten beside the fireplace. The boy stayed up, watchful, his back to the wall, one hand always resting on the girl's foot as if afraid she might vanish without touch. Asher didn't sleep. He sat in the corner of the room, staring at the two of them, wondering what kind of world abandoned children in the middle of the woods, and what kind of man he would have to become now that they had found his door. He didn't know their names, he didn't know where they had come from or what they had lost. But as the storm clawed at the windows and the fire crackled low, one truth began to burn quietly inside him. Someone had to choose them, not because they were his, not because he had to, but because someone, somewhere, once chose not to. And Asher knew too well what it meant to be the one not chosen to bomb. This was no longer just a story about being exiled for being different. It was becoming something else entirely. A new chapter, a quiet beginning in the coldest night. And that's how it started. The story of a man who once lost everything for being himself, and then found something more than he ever believed he deserved. If stories like this speak to your heart, don't forget to follow Heart Stories for more, because sometimes family doesn't knock twice. The storm passed in the early hours, leaving behind a silence that rang louder than the wind ever had. The world outside the cabin was blanketed in white, untouched and solemn. Inside, warmth returned slowly through bowls of reheated soup, knitted blankets, and a rusted guitar strumming lullabies no one had heard in years. Asher hadn't expected them to stay. He thought the children would sleep, recover, and be taken by someone who wore a badge and had a clipboard. Someone better equipped. Someone normal. But when morning came and the radio still crackled with static, when the snow covered the only trail leading out, he realized this was not going to be temporary. He searched the boy's backpack not to invade, but to survive. No phone, no food, only a half-broken compass, a drawing of a treehouse in blue crayon, and a folded birth certificate stained with water and ash. He opened it carefully. The girl's name was Eden, the boy's Micah Hale. The paper shook in Asher's hand. He read it again. Hale, his own last name, the one he hadn't spoken aloud in over a decade. The name he was told to forget, to never claim again. The one that once meant family, and now only tasted like rust. He sat down, breath catching in his chest. Micah was the son of Claire Hale, his half-sister. The same Claire who had screamed at him across their mother's kitchen table, who called him unnatural, who spat at his feet and slammed the door when he begged her to believe that who he loved had nothing to do with how much he loved them. She was the one who told their parents that Asher had to go, and they listened. He had not seen her since that day, and now her son, her blood, was sleeping under his roof, curled next to a sister he had no memory of, in a house she never knew existed. Asher stared into the fireplace, numb. 1,000 thoughts collided in his mind. Should he tell the boy? Would it matter? Did family mean anything after a decade of silence and snow? But then Eden stirred. Her little hand reached out in sleep and found his. No hesitation, no question, just trust. He remembered how badly he once wanted to belong, how cold the world was when no one wanted to claim you. Micah didn't know who Asher was, and maybe that was a gift. Maybe that meant he could become something new. Not an uncle, not a stranger, just someone who stayed. By noon, the sun pierced the clouds. The storm was over, but the roads were still buried. Asher climbed onto the roof to adjust the radio antenna and caught a signal just long enough to contact emergency services. They said someone would be there when they could be. That night, he sat with Micah beside the fire and asked gentle questions, where they came from, where they were going. The boy said little, only that there was a car, a crash, then the woods, then Eden's cries. He never mentioned Claire, not once, and maybe that silence said everything. Eden's fever broke 2 nights later. Her eyes opened slowly, scanning the unfamiliar room until they settled on Asher. Her voice cracked when she whispered, "Are you my daddy?" He froze, not in fear, but in something heavier. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "I'm just someone who's here." She smiled anyway. Like that answer was enough, but it wasn't the last time she asked. And weeks later, a doctor's test routine, impersonal, done only to check for matching blood types in case of emergency, would tell him a truth that unraveled every wall he had carefully built. Eden was not just any child, she was his. The hospital smelled of bleach and soft denial. Micah refused to speak much. Eden clung to Asher like ivy to old stone. Doctors examined her injuries, ran their tests, and asked quiet questions about custody, next of kin, the usual. But no one could answer why these 2 children had shown up alone in a forest, cold and bruised, with no one looking for them. It was during a routine blood screening run, in case Eden needed a transfusion, that something unexpected surfaced. Her blood type was AB negative, extremely rare, and in the hospital's regional donor database, only one compatible match existed, Asher Hale. At first, he thought nothing of it. It was just coincidence, luck, until the pediatrician returned, papers in hand and a look that made the world tilt slightly. "She's not just a match," Dr. Henley said quietly. "Her DNA markers, her mitochondrial strands, her immunoglobulin expression, they're a direct parental match to yours. Not uncle-niece, not cousin, direct." He froze as saw, "That's not possible, I've never..." But the memories came back. Years ago, before the cabin, before Maine, he was sleeping on a friend's couch in a small apartment outside Portland. Maine, a jobless, hungry version of himself freshly cast out, still raw from being erased by his own family. A distant friend, someone he barely remembered from his teenage years, worked part-time at a fertility clinic. She'd reached out one night, explaining they were short on donors for a program helping families who couldn't conceive. It was all anonymous, legal, untraceable. He would be helping strangers build a future. He'd signed the papers, donated, and walked away without a second thought. That was nearly a decade ago. Now, that ghost from his past had a name. Eden. She wasn't Micah's sister. The last name on her intake form was different. Her birth certificate listed no father. The woman named as her mother had died recently after a car accident on a rural road, not far from where Micah had also been found. The leading theory from authorities was tragic but plausible. The two children, both caught in the same wreck, fled the crash together. The adults didn't survive. The kids did. Somehow, no one knew why they stuck together. Perhaps they'd been traveling together under one adult's care. Perhaps fate simply knew what it was doing when it scattered them into the trees. What mattered now was simple, impossible truth. Micah was the son of Claire, the woman who once called Asher an abomination and forced him out of the family. Eden was his daughter, and neither child had anyone else left. Asher sat alone in the hallway, the cold floor grounding him. The hospital hummed around him. He tried to picture the mother, this unknown woman who had chosen his donor number out of a stack of files. Had she done it for genetics, for physical traits, for a smile she saw in a blurry photograph? Did she ever tell Eden? He would never know. What he did know was the feel of Eden's hand in his, the way she had asked, "Are you my daddy?" before any test said yes. The way Micah, without a word, had begun copying Asher's quiet routines, lining up his boots, checking the kettle, listening for the night birds. They had chosen him long before blood proved anything. Later that evening, Eden woke from a nap and looked at him, her voice groggy. "Are you still going to be here tomorrow?" Asher didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "As long as you want me." She smiled, then closed her eyes. The sun slipped beneath the line of pine trees outside. In a world where nothing was ever promised, Asher finally understood what it meant to be part of something that didn't ask for perfection, just presence. He had opened a door. Now, he had 2 reasons to never shut it again. The court date came sooner than anyone was ready for. In the weeks that followed the hospital stay, Asher had filled out more paperwork than he'd touched in his entire life. Guardianship forms, background checks, home assessments. Every time he thought he had proven enough, someone new asked, "Are you sure you're capable?" He never heard that question when he was alone in the woods, learning how to survive with frostbitten fingers and cracked knuckles. But now, standing as a father, he was under more scrutiny than ever before. The judge was an older woman with gray hair tied tight at the nape. She looked at Asher not with cruelty, but calculation. The kind of stare that had read hundreds of files before his. The kind that didn't flinch at words like homosexual or unmarried male caretaker, but didn't embrace them either. Micah sat beside a guardian ad litem, hands folded neatly, eyes cautious. Eden fidgeted with the sleeve of her sweater on Asher's other side. She had dressed herself in her best, the purple corduroy overalls she liked because they had a star stitched into the pocket. Across the courtroom, a man and a woman sat rigid in tailored clothing. The woman was Claire's sister-in-law. The man was her husband. They had filed a formal petition to adopt Micah, and possibly Eden arguing that children belonged with blood, not strangers in cabins. The woman spoke first. "Micah is our nephew. He has our name, our resources. We can provide stability, a proper school, a social network. Mr. Hale lives alone in a rural home without neighbors, structure, or traditional parenting experience." She paused, glancing at Eden with a smile too practiced. "We're willing to take in both children. It's better they stay together, of course." Asher stood when the judge called his name. His shirt sleeves were too short. His shoes bore the red tint of soil. He didn't prepare a speech because survival never came with monologues. "I didn't ask for them to find me," he said. "I didn't look for them, but when they appeared at my door, cold and lost, I didn't hesitate. Not because I knew them, not because I wanted something, but because I know what it feels like to be told you're not worth keeping." He looked down briefly, then back up. "Micah is my nephew. Eden is my daughter. But more than that, they're 2 children who trust me, even when they have every reason not to trust anyone." The judge flipped through papers. There's a history here, Sue. The county attorney noted. Mr. Hale has no prior parenting record. His donation to a fertility clinic, though legal, complicates the biological claim without adoption proceedings, and we cannot ignore that he has no consistent employment history or listed emergency contacts. It was then that Micah stood. He had not spoken through the entire process, not during the interviews, not during the in-home visits, but now, with his voice low and flat, he addressed the judge. They didn't come for us after the accident. He did. The courtroom hushed. I remember the fire in the cabin, the sound of his boots, the way he held Eden when she was crying. I don't care if it's legal or what word you use. He's our home. The judge leaned back slowly. Her eyes softened, just slightly. Later that afternoon, the ruling came. Temporary guardianship granted to Asher Hale for both children. Full custody to be determined, pending psychological evaluations and a final home review. It was a partial win, but it felt like the first breath after years underwater. Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered. One recognized Eden from the recent news piece, the girl who had kept calm during a fire drill that almost turned deadly. Asher lifted her into his arms and pushed past the flashbulbs. Micah followed, hand in pocket, eyes alert. They didn't speak until they reached the truck. Asher turned the ignition. The heater stuttered to life. Did we do okay? Eden asked softly. Asher looked at them through the rearview mirror. You did more than okay. You showed them who we are. But even as the truck rolled away, he knew it wasn't over. Because families, real ones, are rarely earned in courtrooms. They're built day by day, in the quiet moments, in scraped knees, in burnt toast, in the long nights of fever and lullabies. And that was the fight he had already won. The court gave him 6 months, 6 months to prove he was more than a man with calloused hands in a quiet house. 6 months to show that love, built in silence and scraped together with firewood and whispered lullabies, could hold stronger than names printed on paper. Asher spent every day like it mattered. Because it did. He took Eden to school in a borrowed truck that smoked at the corners. He helped Micah with math problems he barely remembered. He learned how to braid hair from a YouTube video and how to file meal reimbursement forms from a volunteer at the town center. Nothing about it was easy, but everything about it felt true. Then came the fire. It happened on a Thursday. A faulty space heater in a classroom sparked smoke into the hallway. Children panicked. Teachers froze. But Eden remembered what Asher had taught her in the cabin, how to move low, how to stay calm, how to think while afraid. She opened the back door when others didn't know where to run. She let a boy with asthma out and kept another girl from going back in. She was 8. The local news ran the story with awe. Child hero prevents panic during school fire. And when the reporter asked where she learned how to stay calm under pressure, she said, "My dad taught me. He said fire isn't always the enemy. Sometimes it's just something that wants to be seen." Asher didn't watch the segment, but the court did. At the final custody hearing, Claire's sister-in-law made one last argument. Her attorney emphasized stability, wealth, opportunity. She had the life Claire once wanted: big house, polished furniture, a schedule for everything. Asher had none of that, but he had a child who stood in fire and did not run, a boy who had once refused to speak, now willing to stand beside him in every room. When asked if she felt safe, Eden answered without blinking, "He doesn't just keep us safe. He makes us brave." The courtroom was silent. The judge looked between them, then at her file. She closed it quietly. Full custody granted. Of Micah, his nephew by bloodline. Of Eden, his daughter by something far deeper. Outside, there were no reporters this time, just cold wind and a gravel parking lot and the sound of boots crunching towards something permanent. In the truck, Eden asked, "Does this mean we don't have to leave again?" Asher looked at her through the rearview mirror. "No, sweetheart," he said. "It means we're home." That night, he chopped wood while Micah read aloud and Eden colored stars on the cabin wall. The fire crackled softly before an arm. The walls were still rough, the floors still creaked, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was full. This wasn't the life Asher had planned. It was better. Not because it was perfect, but because, for once, he was chosen, and because he chose back. What makes someone a parent? The name on a paper, or the love that never asked for proof? If this story stayed with you, don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories for more healing journeys, real love, and the families we find in unexpected places.